Thank you. Well, good morning. I'm looking at all the names and faces, and I think everybody here has been through a full introduction with Tom's background. Is that right? Is there anybody new today? All right, well, let's save a minute or two on that, and I'll turn it over to Tom down in Florida.
Thank you, Brad. It feels early in the morning today to me. I hope that we're all going to be able to be up and alert as time goes on. Wanted to talk today, especially in our our concluding episode, about the continuing development of nonviolent sociopolitical campaigns and movements. After we've gone up through the American Civil Rights movement, and we covered Gandhi, and we've seen Martin Luther King and everybody. I'm going to just switch over to looking at our the PowerPoint, and with one oops, I got to click on it. The first kind of little vignette I want to mention is one that really, I mean, just to show the out of the box strategizing possibilities that can happen. Saul Alinsky is probably a vaguely kind of historically familiar name. He was a really pushy, aggressive guy who drove people nuts. He was a nonviolent activist going way back, and became really an expert at bringing attention to situations where people are in need of justice. One story is, and Alinsky himself told this story, it may not even actually have turned out to be a true thing that happened, but it's a story that has become part of nonviolent literature. In 1965, Alinsky was called to Rochester, New York by the Black community there. Eastman Kodak ran Rochester, and Eastman Kodak had a gigantic corporate facility there, and the crown jewel of the town, and the kind of the focus of this corporate elite who lived there was the world famous Rochester Symphony Orchestra. The Kodak magnates in Rochester lived lavishly, and the corporate facility itself had been likened to a southern plantation moved north. And Kodak had been criticized by the Black community for its unwillingness to hire Black people to anything but the very lowest levels of job levels in their company, and their bad treatment, their poor treatment of their Black employees. Riots broke out the previous year in 1964, and there were burnings and deaths in Rochester. So in '65, when Alinsky came, the Black people in the town had run out of patience, but they'd also run out of ideas about how they could change anything. And when Alinsky arrived, because the Kodak people refused to talk, so they didn't seem to have any leverage for a strike or a boycott. So Alinsky supposedly proposed an out-of-box tactical scheme, and that is that they bought about 100 seats to the symphony performance that was going to be coming up, where all the finery and the finest in their finery would be there for this elite event. He bought 100 seats secretly, and then passed without these tickets to the Black community. But before the concert, knowing that this would drive the people crazy who came to this grand event, he hosted for these 100 people a large dinner, a copious amount of beans, of baked beans. And the idea being that they were going to show up, and they were going to sit there in their seats all dressed up, and they were going to start farting their way to nonviolent success. Now it's like I said, I'm not sure that this actually happened, but just the fact that it was a kind of idea shows that the kind of possibilities that might be called up when people are really inventive. Cesar, going to move to Cesar Chavez, another familiar name from the past. Cesar Chavez and his career shows the importance of and the capacity of boycotts and strikes for disadvantaged workers. Chavez was born a migrant, or he grew up a migrant laborer in California. He's in Mexican heritage, and he lived a life of economic, political, and social disadvantage. This kind of quasi-slavery that had been depicted so well in Steinbeck's *The Grapes of Wrath*. His dream was to create a migrant workers union, which would serve and protect farm workers in California and neighboring states, Arizona. He co-founded the National Farm Workers Association, which became the United Farm Workers Union, the UFW. As the leader of this union, Chavez endured poverty and lived with the people rather than accepting. The president, John Kennedy, had offered him a kind of a cushy Washington sort of job, a figurehead job, but he chose to stay with the people. And he led the Delano Grape Strike of 1965 to 70. And note how long some of these actions take to produce effect. The Grape Strike and other strikes that he organized used nonviolent pickets, boycotts, and worker sit-down strikes in order to create an economic leverage over the employers, who had taken for granted that this labor force. Chavez became a leftist and progressive icon in the United States and a folk saint among Mexican Americans. He was later awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The story of Lech Walesa, I don't know how they get Valenza out of W-A-L-E-S-A, but that's how I guess it's pronounced. The story of Lech Walesa and Polish solidarity is another kind of vaguely familiar story. Some of you may know a lot about it, probably more than I do. But it's a story that I think is significant, not only to showing that nonviolent protest and nonviolent action can overcome a deeply entrenched and overly cruel dictatorship, but also that it could be that it can be done by workers rising up on their own. Since 1939, Poland had been under dictatorial rule, first of Nazi Germany, and then of rigid Soviet-controlled communism. In 1970, about more than a decade or more before the events of this little story happened, Soviet tanks brutally crushed an angry uprising from the Gdansk shipyard, killing 6 people and injuring 300. Lech Walesa was one of the leaders of that revolt in 1970. Through that decade, Walesa studied and learned the importance of strategy, organization, preparation, and nonviolence if he were going to succeed. He became convinced that you can't go up against dominant violence with your own violence and come away with anything. In 1980, Walesa led striking shipyard workers and taking over their shipyard in Gdansk. News of their action reached Radio Free Europe and the BBC. So the outside world became informed, which starts to ignite this moral jujitsu we've talked about. People outside the shipyard also organized, and 22 other Gdansk factories and public transportation struck the next day. Walesa and the union demanded the rights to unionize and to strike, which were unprecedented rights in communist Poland. They faced the dangers of Soviet military action coming again. The demands of Gdansk shipyard workers galvanized striking workers in other cities in Poland. More factories joined the now national strike. 500,000 workers all of a sudden were refusing to work. The Polish economy immediately began suffering from all the lost production. The factories were hostages, essentially, for the strikers who were staying in the factories. After 18 days of strikes, Walesa and the labor union won pay raises, a 5-day work week, reduced censorship, and the crucial rights to unionize and strike. However, they knew the government would break their promises. So Valença immediately led activists going around the country and recruiting new Solidarity members and hundreds of new unions. Solidarity membership grew to 10 million. The explosive growth of Poland's unionization outraced the government's plans to quash the strikes with violence. They were ready to crush 1,000 people, and then they had 10,000. They were ready to try to go against 10,000, and they were up against 100,000 and a million. The government arrested the union leaders, beat and imprisoned hundreds, and imposed martial law. But Valença realized the government violence was evidence that it had lost its ability to control the people. The people would no longer accept the old tyranny. 7 years of repression followed. 7 years. So again, they consider that the time involved from the beginning of nonviolent action to what may become the end. And this repression gave the appearance of a stable power in Poland. But the Polish communist government's political and economic strength had deteriorated. In 1988, the government collapsed under the paralyzing weight of economic failure and a new wave of solidarity strikes. Lech Walesa negotiated, and Poland returned to work. In early 1989, Poland entered a new future with free unions, a free press, and parliamentary elections. In the 1989 elections, Poland's first in over 60 years, Solidarity candidates won by a 10-to-1 margin over the communist candidates. Nonviolent struggle had defeated the communist dictatorship. In 1983, Lech Walesa was ordered the Nobel Peace Prize. The story of South Africa is another one that is familiar, but a very complicated and very long story. It shows the complications of violence, violent protest. This story will show the strength and the power of external pressure from outside the country, and the power of nonviolent protest, nonviolent resistance. From 1948 through the 1990s, South African apartheid kept the country's majority Black population under the heavy racist thumb of a small white minority, where everything sharply restricted everything from rights to speech, to right to work, to right to movement, to savage police and prison practices. Beginning in the 1950s, South African Black political parties and justice advocates organized mass mobilizations, boycotts, strikes, and nonviolent protests against the apartheid system of quasi-slavery. The government reacted with egregious violence. Some South African Blacks turned to armed resistance, among them a young Nelson Mandela, who was arrested for treason in 1961 and was sentenced to life in prison. The government declared recurrent states of emergency and added further apartheid restrictions. Anti-apartheid protests continued through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. As government repression ramped up, protests spread throughout South Africa. In 1976, 10,000 Soweto school children marched in protest, and police massacred more than 100 protesters. In the 1980s, resistance versus apartheid grew even more fierce, and international attention focused on the South African government's tyranny. Nelson Mandela, now committed to nonviolent resistance, became a world-famous inspiration. Foreign businesses and governments pressured the government of South Africa and brought economic sanctions against South African government, creating economic losses for South Africa. At the same time, Black South Africans, led by Mksele Jack and others, organized boycotts of stores and work strikes, which crippled the whites' economic power. In 1989, South African President Botha resigned, and his successor lifted political bans, freed Nelson Mandela, and negotiated expansive changes. In 1994, Mandela was elected president. Here's a picture of the lines of people lined up to vote for the first time in their lives. A new constitution was adopted, and the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission process began. It began healing the horrible wounds of apartheid. Mandela also won the 1993 Nobel Peace Prize. Now I'm going to switch to the video, and Susan, if you'll take over, we're going to show another video clip of another nonviolent movement that is somewhat different from the ones we've seen before.
Okay, folks, I'm going to be sharing the screen, and I'm going to have to adjust it just a tiny bit after I get it started. Okay, I'll just need a thumbs up if you can hear the sound.
Spring 1983. For nearly 10 years, General Augusto Pinochet has ruled Chile unchallenged.
We needed someone to dare to say to the dictator that he was a dictator, and to say that the dictatorship was a dictatorship, and confront it on its own turf. Not on the turf of arms, just to dare to tell them that what we had in Chile was wrong, and that it had to be changed.
Pinochet came to power in a 1973 coup that left the elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, dead.
During the first months of the military regime, the number of people detained in prisons reached more than 40,000. At least 3,000 individuals were assassinated, executed, or their bodies disappeared forever.
Ruthlessly eliminating any challenge to his authority, Pinochet's rule cast fear into every corner of Chilean life.
It was a very permeating paranoia, and it was with everyone. Everybody had experienced some sort of oppression in their family, and they were very cautious. My husband and I would go to a social gathering, and he wouldn't introduce me to anyone. And I said, well, why won't you introduce me to people? He said, oh, we don't do that now. It's too dangerous. You don't really want to know people's names.
Fear, terror. If you have people afraid, you can control them. And Pinochet, if something he will leave in history, he's the man of terror.
Executions, disappearances, and prisons keep the dictatorship in power for 10 years. By 1983, a severe economic crisis has pushed unemployment to 30%. As Chileans feel they have nothing left to lose, open opposition to the regime becomes thinkable for the first time. The first signs of opposition appear at the heart of Chile's economy, in the copper mines of the Andes Mountains. Miners are amongst Chile's best paid workers in the country's largest and most lucrative export industry. Their leader is 29-year-old Rodolfo Seguel, a payroll clerk at Chile's largest copper mine, recently elected president of the National Labor Congress. Seguel wants his members to take the first step, a nationwide strike.
10 years had gone by and nobody had gone out into the street. We had to see what reaction the country would have, and then to see if the country would dare to do this. Our goal was to open people's eyes and to tell them, we can do it. It is possible. We can do this.
A week before the strike is to begin, Pinochet's troops surround the copper mines. Seguel knows that there will be bloodshed if the strike goes forward. They change their plans. Instead of a strike, they proclaim a national day of protest. With only a few days to prepare, they must mobilize not just union members, but the whole population.
I remember that morning. At the beginning, you didn't know if someone was walking slowly, driving his car slowly, or walking slowly on the sidewalk, because he was just taking a walk or because they were protesting. Until finally at noon, it was so obvious. It was so obvious that everything was slower. It was so evident that the city started to close down.
As darkness falls, no one knows whether the final overt act of protest will succeed. At exactly 8 p.m., it begins, tentatively at first.
And the next day, there was a sense of sort of, what did you do last night? Did you see it? Oh yes, I was out banging my pots and pans with my neighbors. And so there was a real sense of complicity all of a sudden in a society where each human being had literally become a complete island.
And the next day, when the protest finished, at the first meeting that we had, we decided to have a protest every month. And we did that during 9 or 10 months. Every month a protest. And that was chaos for the military regime, because we didn't protest with arms. That gave us more power.
A mood approaching euphoria grows as the protests grow every month. People start to believe that mass demonstrations alone will bring down the dictatorship. Mainstream opposition protests are strictly non-violent. Brutal police repression of the monthly demonstrations seems intended to intimidate, to stop the movement, but it has no effect. In early August, one day before the fourth protest is scheduled, Pinochet installs a new interior minister, Sergio Harpa. Harpa is instructed to begin a dialogue with the opposition. In a contradictory gesture on the same day, Pinochet deploys thousands of troops in the streets of the capital. An ominous prelude to the next day's demonstrations. Security forces break up the August protest with unprecedented force. A police statement admits that 17 civilians have been killed. The actual number is much higher.
It was very violent, and that's when I realized that we couldn't keep on going down this road. Because the violence was too strong. Pinochet had 16,000 soldiers on the streets of Santiago. More than 80 people were killed, and the population started to rebel.
Shocked by the bloodshed, the new Cardinal of Chile's Catholic Church offers to host the dialogue that Pinochet has promised.
At the first meeting, Gabriel Valdez told me that he had to give me a document. And I told him that I would not take this document because it is an agreement that you drew up this morning, demanding the resignation of the President of the Republic. That you don't recognize him as being legitimate. And if the President of the Republic is not the legitimate president, I have nothing to do here, because I represent him. So this is where it all ends, right here.
Buenos días.
As Pinochet celebrates his birthday in November, he has stopped Sergio Harper's meetings with the opposition. Harper's small concessions, limited political activity, the return of exiles, an end to book censorship were too much for the general. The dialogue is over.
No there wasn't any result. It was very frustrating. The regime didn't change at all. And Harpa himself was left there as a politician with no importance. In fact, the control of the government passed on to much harder hands.
Opposition groups have been naive to think that Pinochet would negotiate an end to his own power. Protesters have not loosened the dictator's grip, but they have shown Pinochet they cannot be crushed by force, and they have opened up political space they will use to organize against him.
Viva Chile!
In late November 1985, 500,000 attend the largest political rally in Chilean history. Gabriel Valdez speaks for 11 opposition parties and the Catholic Church. The National Accord, formed to lead a non-violent transition to democracy. Valdez warns, if we don't support the National Accord, we are heading towards civil war. In Chile's poor neighborhoods, the poblaciones, a low-intensity war has already begun. Hard times have fallen hardest here, making fertile ground for Chile's Marxist and Communist parties. Not many have personally taken up arms, but the ideology of violent revolution is accepted. The regime sees the poblaciones as enemy territory. Young men in the poblaciones are rounded up, interrogated in stadiums and fields, and hauled off to prison without trial. Hundreds are never seen again. Pinochet's human rights abuses have drawn the normally conservative Catholic Church into the conflict. Though the clergy takes no political position, the Church protests against the torture, killings, and disappearances, and preaches non-violent methods.
If you use violence, then you have to have the force to defend yourself. Whatever you impose through violence, you have to defend through violence. That's why we think that violence is the strength of the weak, because they don't have arguments, they don't have moral authority. So whatever you achieve through violence, you have to defend through violence.
Monthly protests turn violent as the radicals confront police, handing Pinochet the excuse he needs to come down on all opposition. Mainstream factions are harshly criticized for their non-violent methods.
In those conditions, when you are repressed by violence, of course there are people that think that the only way to face violence is through violence. But that was, in our understanding, absolutely out of any possibility of succeeding.
In late summer of 1986, the prospect of full-scale civil war becomes real. Chilean intelligence uncovers a cache of arms in the northern desert and traces them to a guerrilla group affiliated with the Chilean Communist Party. Markings show the weapons have come from Cuba. Pinochet says it's proof that his opponents are preparing a revolution. A few weeks later, heavily armed guerrillas attack General Pinochet's motorcade on a remote mountain road. State news media report that 5 presidential guards have died, but do not mention Pinochet. Four hours later, the dictator appears on television to describe the attack. He appears unfazed by his narrow escape and returns to the presidential palace with his customary swagger. The episode reinforces his image of invincibility.
It really polarized, I think, between, are we going to go for a really serious attempt at armed struggle, the way we've seen in Central America, with a huge toll on human lives and suffering that was part of that? Or are we going to try to find some other way, which was very nebulous, and so this search began to find some way that could provide some kind of an exit from this impasse.
Pinochet's own constitution calls for a plebiscite in 1988, giving Chileans the right to vote yes or no to another 8 years of military government. Isolated and overconfident, Pinochet always assumed he would win. But after 5 years of organizing, the non-violent opposition sees an opportunity.
For the first time, we knew that if Pinochet was going to remain in power, there's going to be a plebiscite, and you have to say yes or no. Therefore, we say, look, if we prepare ourselves, we can defeat Pinochet saying no.
And we said, how are we going to trust the dictator that has been doing all these things, and he will count the votes, that he count the votes as the votes are? But we realized that we had no other way, and we said, let's move ahead in that direction, and let's create all the conditions to avoid any fraud.
Thousands of volunteers take to the countryside in a door-to-door campaign to convince Chileans that they can vote no without fear of reprisal, and that the results will not be rigged. They are greeted with suspicion and skepticism. To create the appearance of a fair vote, Pinochet and the generals write new election laws. Any opposition party that can collect 35,000 signatures will be allowed to have poll watchers, a critical factor to prevent vote fraud, and be given 15 minutes of television time every night for 4 weeks before the voting.
And I said, look, if you register, I'm going to be on TV. And the day that I'm going to be in TV, I will tell to Mr. Pinochet that he has to go.
Primero dijo, usted, General Pinochet.
After his party is certified, Lagos gets his chance when he appears on the Chilean equivalent of Meet the Press.
Le voy a recordar, General Pinochet.
He holds up a newspaper clipping in which Pinochet is quoted saying he will not be a candidate in the plebiscite.
Y ahora le promete al país otros 8 años, con tortura, con asesinatos, con violación de derechos humanos. Me parece inadmisible que un chileno tenga tanta ambición de poder de pretender estar 25 años en el poder.
His daring performance makes Ricardo Lagos a celebrity overnight, and his performance foreshadows the significance of television in the coming No campaign. Pinochet's vulnerability is human rights. The No campaign plans television spots to emphasize torture death, and prison. But US political consultants advised them that dwelling on the fears of the past would be a turnoff.
They developed a campaign that was future-oriented, a campaign that focused on bread and butter issues, and it was a campaign that ultimately caught the Pinochet regime and the supporters of the yes vote by complete surprise when it was aired on the first night in that last 30 days of the campaign.
Porque nace el arco iris después de la tempestad, porque quiero que florezcan mil maneras de pensar, porque sin la dictadura la alegría va a llegar, porque pienso en el futuro, voy a decir que no.
That no, what was meaning yes to democracy was meaning yes to more social justice and not no to injustice.
And la alegría ya viene, meaning joy is around the corner. It was an invitation to a country that belonged to everyone. The idea that we were going to defeat the dictatorship, not with a gun, but a pencil. That this road was going to be traveled without hate, without rancor, without vengeance.
On television, the No campaign is a sensation. Images of a bright future without Pinochet. The TV spots earn credibility with skeptical viewers, with compelling references to the suffering inflicted by the dictatorship.
People used to rush home to watch those spots. I used to rush home to watch those spots. It was like, 15 minutes where, they use real words to say real things, Torture is torture, and it happened here. And after all these years of denial, there it was for the first time on television. Poverty exists.
Buenos días, don Aníbal. Deme dos marraquetas.
Little old ladies don't even have enough money in their purses to buy a tea bag for their afternoon tea.
Voy a llevarte también.
¿Cómo no? ¿Dos bolsitas?
Una nomás.
No más miseria.
Información de este minuto para el diario de Cooperativa dice que a muy pocas horas de que se inicie el plebiscito en Chile, voto no. No. Voto sí. Sí. No.
Opposition poll watchers now perform a parallel vote count based on sampling techniques. By fax and telephone, the numbers are fed to computers in Santiago. By early evening, they project the no has won decisively. A small independent radio station announces the results. Ensconced in the presidential palace, Pinochet says nothing. Suspicions of electoral fraud grow as hours pass with no announcement of the vote tally. At midnight, Pinochet's Navy, Air Force and police commanders enter the palace. General Fernando Matei, Air Force commander, tells reporters, it appears the no has won. A public statement that warns Pinochet to accept the defeat. Within seconds, his remarks are on the radio.
The great strength was that it did really come from ordinary, extraordinary people. And they really did put their lives on the line, and they really did come out, and they really were willing to take a stand.
I think that we, in the world, we really live on power. And what we would like to is to live on authority, personal authority, moral authority. When you act based on power, well, if I have a gun pointed at me, I'm going to say whatever you think and you want. After you take your gun off my head, I'm going to do what I want.
How people lived that moment. And they lived it without hatred, convinced that they had been the participants, the actors. Here there was no charismatic leader, no guerrilla, no vanguard that would say, I did this. The sense in Chile that night was that they had done it themselves. How many? 7 million.
Wow. Brings tears to my eyes. Wanted to take a couple of minutes here to talk about what insights you may have kind of picked up while watching this story about Chile. Anything that seems that's different, new, or just kind of brought forward in higher relief. What are your thoughts?
The excitement of the victory was fascinating. The dancing around, celebrating, they made it.
What a triumph.
They really had to be brave to vote no. They had to show their strength in numbers there. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and this is in a country where where disappearances, these disappearances, people would in the night, security people, the police would come and kidnap people, and they would just be gone. And people lived in terrible fear of these things. Families would be disappeared. So they knew that those were possibilities.
The disappearance probably meant killed.
Yes.
Not necessarily, but probably.
Yeah.
I noted that the church got actively involved.
Good.
And I thought that was important.
And many times the church has stayed on the wrong side of these things, but here the church got involved. Any thoughts about the strategy employed by the protesters early on, later, and at any point of going in the preparation for this election?
I think the change from being a positive instead of a negative really made a difference, something to look forward to instead of reliving all of the grief that they've been through. And that I think that really made a difference in people's participating. It was really excellent. The slogans and videos were really so positive and gave people hope again. It could be different.
The way in which that kind of harkens back in my head. It harkens back to the Serbian story we saw where humor was used so much as a way to lighten these very important messages.
In my naivety, where is Chile now?
Chile is involved again in strife now, more civil and human rights contentiousness, and I don't know exactly how it's spinning out, but I know that there have been protests, and some of the economic conditions often spur these things, but I think they've had civil and human problems again.
Tom, do you know the United States position with regard to Chile during the 80s when this turmoil happened?
I'm not terribly familiar with it, John, but our pattern has been to be supportive of military dictatorships because it's relatively easy to work economically with, for American investors to make money, and democratic reforms often are associated with economic reforms, everything from land redistribution to to higher tax rates on the wealthy, and these things are not what what major investors want to be engaged in. And Chile's biggest industry is its I think it's copper mining, and it's they have that gives anybody who has control of the Chilean economy has a lot of clout internationally on that basis.
Okay. Yeah.
Tom, didn't Pinochet make a mistake as Milosevic did in overestimating their popularity by agreeing to have an election? It seemed like the opposition was thwarted before that, and he gave them an opening, didn't he, by agreeing to this referendum?
I agree. It seems really, given the kind of power that he was exercising, it seems incredible that he would have allowed an election to proceed, and that he wouldn't have much more effectively controlled the results. He had to have overestimated his own popularity or the fear that he generated, and clearly he expected to be able to control the results no matter what the actual voting was. And then what happened? What happened at the last minute that tipped everything?
Well, the military, wasn't that crucial? Just like the military last week stood down, not in a form. I guess this was more of the generals formally supporting him. Last week, it was the average people, average soldiers, wasn't it, that just didn't resist swarming of the Capitol building or whatever that was.
Right, and we're going to talk a little bit we're going to talk about that point in a little bit. If the security forces of a dictatorship either refuse to go along with orders or openly rebel or do something to kind of stand down, it increases the likelihood of success of a nonviolent movement by 46 times.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it is almost crucially required to get some compliance of the security forces.
I thought it was cool when it saw the people the military shaking hands with the people in the street. That was cool.
Yeah, just it makes you believe that change could really happen. And what a triumph for the people! The advertising program that they generated just seems to have been kind of a perfect pitch. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit now about some. We got to switch over to where is it? There it is, the share screen. I'm going to go over some other informational stuff here a little bit. And we got it. And talk about a couple of books. Sharon Nepstad wrote a book, Nonviolent Revolutions, and it's a study of nonviolent revolutions from 1978 to 2011, where she looked at 35 nonviolent revolutions that she'd been able to get thorough information about. She defined in her study, she defined a nonviolent revolution as a civilian-based form of struggle that employs social, economic, and political forms of power without resorting to violence or the threat of violence. And she's looking at here not just at changing something, at overcoming some injustice or some change in structure, but of actually overcoming a regime, of overturning a regime. authoritarian regime. And she's trying to address the basic question, why do some nonviolence fail? You know, an example might be China in 1989, the Tiananmen Square revolt. And why do some succeed? The factors producing regime change are different from factors that enable resistors to successfully establish a new system. That is, overturning a government doesn't mean you're going to get a better system afterwards. It's a different set of factors that are required to establish a better government, a new political system. And this is something that's very much in favor of nonviolent revolutions as opposed to violent ones. In her study of 35 nonviolent revolutions, which you had a chance to look at this list, 60% of these 35 produced regime change, and another 3 yielded some reforms. But only 20 at the same time, over the same period, only 25% of violent revolutions achieved regime change. So the nonviolent revolutions were more than twice as likely to succeed in turning over the regime. And Nepstad found several conditions to be crucial to the success of revolutions. One is widespread grievances against the state. A second is a shift of the national elites' allegiance from the state to the opposition. That is, something turns the elite beneficiaries of state power against the state. You know, often that's economic. We've seen very often they start to see that they're suffering economically from strikes and boycotts. A third piece is that people must be so angered by regime injustices that they are willing to act and that they're willing to take risks. Opposition groups also must unify around some ideology of rebellion that focuses their anger on why the regime is to blame and what can be done, thus channeling anger into action. This is the strategizing, organizing, and educating, and preparing a kind of a sequence of possible actions. And mobilizing organizations finally organizations are needed to coordinate, support, and direct the uprising. The strategies of violent and nonviolent rebellions are different. Violent rebellion relies on the ability to create armed forces greater than those of the state. This is extremely expensive and bases the rebellion's eventual power in military violence. The strategy, on the other hand, of nonviolent revolution is based in an alternate concept of political power. The Gandhian model holds that nonviolent uprisings can defeat even ruthless dictators if people are willing to withdraw their support from the regime, regardless of the costs. A different kind of angle, the electoral model, aims to transform rigged elections into fair elections. This is often difficult, and as we saw in the Chilean case, it may even require some unexpected help. But cross-class coalitions, increasing voter registration, expanding voter turnout, soliciting the help of domestic and international election monitors, and demonstrating if the election results are rigged or stolen. In 2005, I think it was, in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution there won an election, and of course the incumbent claimed that he'd won, but people demonstrated and struck, and there was a kind of a national strike, and they were able to overturn the incumbent dictator. A previous study by Chenoweth and Stefan, this is a study of 323 revolutions, nonviolent and violent, from 1900 through 2006, analyzed 160 variables among these 323 histories. And they came up with some really interesting conclusions. One is that regime repression often backfires against the regime. And we've seen this, and this is moral jujitsu. where the regime's brutality stimulates society's conscience and coalesces a larger and larger number of people against the regime's policies. Political jujitsu is just a variant that focuses on on domestic and international support for the regime turning against the regime, either often because of economic reasons. And another conclusion is that repression may mobilize more and more people, more of the civilian population, to join the revolt. If a movement, here's an interesting one, if a movement can pull 3.5% of the population into demonstrations, onto the streets, into active, visible support, movements almost always succeed in their objective. This 3.5% is a figure that relates to nonviolent revolutions. It's interesting that I think in the militia groups that were coalescing in the hope of stealing the election in favor of Donald Trump, there was I think one of their basic lines is that they're 3%ers. That is, if 3% of people will rise up, that they can succeed. And I wonder if they pulled it, if that was pulled from this study of nonviolent revolutions. Countries in which there were nonviolent campaigns were about 10 times likelier to succeed in transition to democracy within a 5-year period compared to countries in which there were violent revolutions. That is, nonviolent revolts were 10 times as likely to end up resulting in democracy, even if the campaign itself failed. So that just the activation of a nonviolent movement decatuples, or whatever the word would be, the chance of eventual movement toward democracy. And a final piece is, like as I said before, security force defections in any significant form make a nonviolent regime change 46 times as likely to succeed. So it becomes an extremely important point to try to move the military away from the dictator. And I've got my own political stance, which not everybody may share, but I was fearful that at some point in our run up to our own election in November, I was fearful that that the president might try to start a war or try to generate military action against demonstrators, and I was hoping that the military would refuse in some kind of way. I'm happy that it didn't come to that, but that was in my mind. Gene Sharp, I just wanted to kind of mention, Gene Sharp has been called the Clausewitz of nonviolent warfare. That is kind of the writer who has formalized thinking and put it down for study. Sharp founded the Albert Einstein Institution in 1983 to promote research, policy studies, and education on the strategic uses of nonviolent struggle in the face of dictatorship, war, genocide, and oppression. Although Sharp went to Ohio State, he dedicated his life to the study and teaching of nonviolent struggle. In an academic and professional career spanning more than 6 decades, Gene Sharp articulated and advanced the cause of nonviolent action for change. His writings and ideas, along with his close study of Gandhi and dictatorships, have transformed nonviolent struggles for freedom around the world. He consulted with resistance and pro-democracy groups in Serbia, Myanmar, Thailand, Tibet, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, and elsewhere, and his books have been guidebooks for nonviolent sociopolitical change in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, South and Central America, and Central and Southeast Asia. Perhaps the most important part of Sharp's influence as a global nonviolent action educator has been his clear lessons regarding organizational development, strategic analysis, internal education, and understanding the broad range of tactical options in nonviolent action. Bringing down a dictator last week, we've seen the profound, empowering influence of Sharp's writings. Oh, excuse me, I gotta go back here. In our homework for today, we've seen Sharp's list of the methods of nonviolent action. As dictators and authoritarian regimes learn from other oppressors' defeats, that is, as dictators and authoritarian regimes are learning from what they've been seeing in nonviolent movements, they're working to develop their own new strategies and tactics. Chief among them at this point are efforts to lure nonviolent activists into violence and closures of internet communications. Sharp has led the continuing development of nonviolent strategies and tactics. Gene Sharp died in 2018. And wanted to move at this point finally to the continuing development of nonviolent campaigns and movements in our current era of internet suppression and social media. The Arab Spring was a series of nonviolent anti-government protests and uprisings, and subsequent armed rebellions that began in Tunisia and spread across much of the Arab world, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain, beginning in early 2011. These nonviolent campaigns began in response to oppressive regimes and a low standard of living. A major slogan of these nonviolent campaigns was, "The people want to bring down the regime." Leaders of 4 countries were forced out of power: in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. Other major sustained demonstrations followed in Morocco, Iraq, Algeria, Iranian Kazakhstan, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, and Sudan. The promulgation of these nonviolent campaigns was heavily dependent on social media, and the targeted authoritarian regimes attempted to block social media to inhibit protest organization. Regimes responded with violence, and the wave of initial Arab Spring successes faded by mid-2012. In some areas, protesters answered violence with their own violence. Despite the early Arab Spring nonviolent successes, a number of large-scale conflicts have resulted. The Syrian civil war, the ISIS war, civil war in Iraq, the Egyptian coup and subsequent instability, the Libyan civil war, and the Yemeni crisis and civil war. Regimes that lacked major oil wealth and hereditary succession arrangements have proven more likely to undergo lasting regime change. Those regimes that did have or have had oil wealth and hereditary succession arrangements have been more difficult to dislodge. Early hopes that these popular movements would end corruption and increase political participation and bring about greater economic equity have quickly collapsed. The Arab Spring failures owe much to the loss of nonviolent discipline and the lack of strategic use of nonviolent sanctions against their dictatorial regimes. Now, I'm going to turn off the PowerPoint here and wanted to talk a little bit about your thoughts related to the Rebecca Solnit piece that we read for today. The Vision, her entitled Vision, Revolution is as Unpredictable and Beautiful as Spring. What were your reactions to this brief essay? Yeah. You had said something about how you appreciated the readings.
Well, what her essay really made me start thinking about what happened here on January 6th and how do we classify that action, and what's happening now in terms of our voting, all these laws on election processes. So even though we have a democracy, it can get challenged very easily. And we had a violent attack on our Capitol. But anyway, it just made me think about all kinds of things that are happening right now in the present time and how we react to it. And it seems like we've just kind of let it pass. And we really we're in a kind of a dangerous time right now. And we're not even, I don't think most people are really aware of it, because a democracy needs nurturing and caring for, and making it a success. And we could lose that very easily if we're not careful. And I guess her article kind of made me think more about where we're at right now in our own country.
Mhm. Thank you.
Well, Tom, I want to say that I read it when you first sent it out, and I reread it this morning, and it is a stunning overview of the events of 2011. It was written 10 years ago in response to what was happening in 2011. And so the thing that stands out for me is she says each revolt has to have a tipping point. And I thought of the George Floyd event in Minneapolis as a real tipping point, which mobilized millions of Americans in many cities to stand with African Americans, despite the fact that the Trump administration has, and following that, has always poo-pooed the idea as a left-wing kind of rebellion against legitimacy of police action. So, I'm saying I have exactly the same question that Sue has. What happened on January 6th? What happened? Who was behind that? What does insurrection mean? I'd be interested in my fellow attenders of your session, Tom, as to what really happened on January 6th.
Yeah, and how does the January 6th rebellion fit in with this 4-week study of nonviolent action, and how does it similar? How is it different? What does it mean?
Violence didn't work.
Yeah, and all the examples you've given us, Tom, are really legitimate complaints, real complaints. These folks, some of them, I think, in good faith, thought they had a real complaint. They certainly acted like they did, but they really didn't. And most people in the country didn't agree with them, too. So I think that's a much different situation than what we've been studying for the last 4 weeks. People who had basically really solid leadership behind them and a good moral case. And the folks on January 6th had neither. And they were violent too.
Yeah, I think you've highlighted the differences that, if you're going to try to generate a nonviolent movement, it's going to rely on gaining broad acceptance, among the population involved, and it's going to require being able to make have the moral high ground in order to pull together the conscience and interest in change of a whole lot of people, and you can't rely on violence to do it. At least that makes it very different from what we're talking about. One of the things that Solnit writes about in this essay is what does she call it? She says in the United States revolution seems to kind of peter out, and interest fades, and it's very hard for things to keep moving and to gain momentum. Why does she think that might be a problem? What are the factors that contribute to that problem in the United States?
The sheer size of the country.
Yeah.
Got the urban versus the rural. That's one factor. And then a lot of these successful nonviolent movements seem to be led by the youth, maybe the urban youth intelligentsia. And now it seems like the January 6th was more the middle-aged, white people. So differences there.
Well, and there are many movements around the world where leadership of women, and not just individual women, so sometimes individual women, but very often large numbers of women have been very effective at kind of neutering the government's willingness to use violence, as if, and it's always been a bit of a mystery to me, but I think if a violent male-run dictatorship might be intimidated by the prospect of having to focus their power on a bunch of people who could be mothers and who aren't men. There's an extra leverage in some situations I think that women can bring as a group, but the kind of the fact that we're just so spread out, and we have in our country a lack of unity, group unity, because we have specified minorities that are viewed disparaged by other groups. She writes about the unpredictability of these things, and John, you mentioned the George Floyd thing, and part of this essay would say, why would George Floyd's death be any different than any of these many other deaths which also have been publicized? But it seems that at some maybe we have hit a tipping point here.
It was so gratuitous. It was so beyond the pale. The 1,000 people who showed up at Collin Park in the early days of the Trump administration were madder than hell that a child was stripped from his parents at the border. This became intolerable for people from Holland, Michigan, to think that this happened. And so it's like the catalyst or the tipping point. It becomes so obvious that millions are rallied. They're recruited to say this has got to stop. And I think the voting of Biden in, with all of his radical socialism leading to communism and a takeover of the United States, is an effort to combat this thing of the rage at executives who managed the economy into the ground and went home with outsized bonuses, rage at the system, rage at sheer gratuitousness of the suffering of those who are being foreclosed upon and laid off. In this country, economic inequality has reached a level it has not seen before the stock market crash of 1929. That is what propelled Biden into power, it seems to me. And so you've got the Trump people who are saying, there's a takeover and it's going to happen in this United States and we're going to stand against it. By God, we're going to stand against it. So you have this tremendous divisiveness and partisanship in the United States that's being worked out now, in my view.
Somebody's got a phone ringing up.
Yeah, that's mine. I'm sorry.
Well,
I
thank
wonder
you.
if we could just discuss the use of social media a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because in the movie that we just saw, social media definitely worked in favor of the majority, with those 15-minute ads that were so useful and, so well received. But then in America, what I don't understand is why so many people have listened to and watched social media for the conspiracy theories and bought into them. So why do we capture people's interest with something as horrendous as some of these conspiracy theories, and yet do not bring them together for something that's so meaningful for all of us?
That's something I wanted to mention too. It's almost like you're operating from different truths. How do you approach someone that has a totally different truth that they're operating from? And some of these are people that I know, and they actually believe certain things that they've read on the internet. The other thing I wanted to mention, George Floyd, I think it was such a tipping point because of the video, you know, the social media and the video of the whole thing for the whole 9 minutes. And it's so representative of the hanging of Black men in particular, that knee on the neck. I mean, it just, I think it really got people's attention more. This stuff has gone on for years and years and years. It's just that everybody actually saw it and witnessed it.
Another thing about George Floyd's trial, which I confess I've watched quite a bit of, is interesting, is in these prior incidents, by and large, a gun has been involved, and it's been an instantaneous decision, right or wrong, by the officers to shoot or not shoot. In this case, the officer had 9.5 minutes to back off, to relax, to do whatever. And that just made the whole thing all the more egregious and all the more indefensible.
I think one of the things that struck me watching it, of course, we've seen it over and over, the expression on Chauvin's face, just sort of looking off into the distance as if nothing was happening. I think that maybe psychologically that kind of affects us too, of it just an expression of his not caring.
It was like a type of depravity. I mean, it was just beyond anything I think everyday people could possibly understand.
Yeah, we watched somebody murder somebody else in public. The question, Joyce, your question about social media, this is going to be an important thing going forward for our society as well. Just how are we going to manage, especially given the management of social media as something that is putting together people who used to who were what I might call wackos, people who've got really unusual ideas and unusual interpretations of what might be real, used to understand that the people around them didn't share those views, and so that they understood that they were outliers or had outlying ideas. Social media can create the impression that they are not outliers because they can connect with others who have similar ideas so easily, so that even though something might be contrary to evidence and evidentiary fact, I think these things can develop, and I think our society is going to have to find a way to manage this more effectively if we're going to have any kind of commonly understood truths at all.
I think that can be evidenced in the questioning of the election results.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how can so many people question what seems to be there? Are we reading different books or different realities?
Yeah.
What? How is it?
I want to move ahead just to summarize the Solnit essay and the Arab Spring thinking about the Arab Spring revolutions themselves and what's happened to them. Some people refer to the region's to this Mediterranean and near Middle East region's past decade as the Arab winter. but I wonder. It's a peace building adage that recovery from chronic oppression, and especially violent oppression, takes about as long. The recovery takes about as long as the oppression was in force. The progress from gross injustice and tyranny cannot be rapid and smooth. There's just too much reform and healing required. And resistance to change, even good change, is always entrenched. I believe, in my own mind, my own hopes as well, that the Arab Spring nonviolent revolutions have been a series of beginnings toward eventual successes. We've seen in every one of these nonviolent movements that we've looked at, these have covered anything from a decade to multiple decades. These have not been one and done kind of American style quick successes. And I think that is the nature of these kind of profound, deep societal changes, especially if they're going to yield better government in the end. And So that's just a point I wanted to make about those things. There have been more recent nonviolent revolutions during this past decade that weren't covered in these by Nepstead and Chenoweth and Hong Kong. Further nonviolent attempts at change in Myanmar, Iran, Belarus, China, Philippines, Central American countries, Palestine, Chile, Sudan, and other places, so that this continues to go on. I wanted to particularly mention too that the use of nonviolent action in environmental protection. If we can think back over decades, Greenpeace, Save the Whales, the attempts to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska, efforts to stop burning fossil fuels, the Keystone Pipeline, the tar sands blockade, and many other things. And a lot of these efforts, in addition to trying to raise public awareness, have focused on protective laws and lawsuits. So it's another nonviolent kind of approach, as well as sit-ins, human blockades, nonviolent interference, and even sabotage, which could be variably seen as nonviolent or violent, depending on what kind of violence we're talking about.
Tom,
yes,
you have a couple. You can finish your thought. I'm sorry. You have a couple things in the chat. So when you're done, let me know and I'll read those out.
Okay, good. I do just a couple last comments, and we'll go to the chat. Over these last couple weeks, we've looked at the history, evolving theory and methods, and tremendous successes of nonviolent action movements and campaigns. We've seen the strengths and weaknesses of nonviolent action, and we've considered when and how and where its methods might be used to defeat structural injustice and dictatorial oppression. The forces of autocracy and entrenched power are learning too, and nonviolent action will have to continue to evolve and educate. The requirements of courage and discipline will always be central to nonviolent campaigns, the willingness to suffer. But the power of the oppressor will always depend on the compliant obedience of the people. And now that the people over the world understand this, people will be able to gain freedom and oppression. So let's turn to the chat questions. How do we, Susan, what do we have?
There are just two of them, and I'm going to read them not in order. And if they've already been answered, you can just let everybody know. But from Jane, what is a nonviolent response to the final decision in the Chauvin trial? Derek Chauvin.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard it a million times.
Oh, if he's not convicted, you're assuming. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's say if he's not convicted, what are your thoughts?
Well, I guess I'm afraid it's going to turn violent, but I think the same kind of nonviolent protests that we've seen last summer, I'm not sure how much tangible good it's done, because some of them did turn violent and very few, but I think it got blown out of proportion a little bit, and it was really negative. I heard for Democrats, there's been actual data on that, how it's been blown up, and so the tangible benefit out of all the demonstrating last year, I guess I'm not sure I grasp what it truly is. It may have helped Biden in some ways, but it may have been an overall net negative. I don't think we really know. I think it helped get Harris the vice presidency, but the tangible difference, I guess I'd be interested in your point of view, Tom, and anybody else's, how it really has helped.
I think the outcome of the trial is good, is important, and it's kind of a piece of if he's held responsible, that's a positive that's a positive little kind of check mark on the progress toward what the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, is aiming for, but it doesn't change the deaths of those who died, and it doesn't change the issues at hand. If nonviolent movement is going to move towards some substantial change, it has to be focused on some policy change, some not just a change in general attitude, but we have to be able to undo some injustice. And if the focus of that is to reform police practices, then I think whether this Chauvin is convicted or not doesn't change, the need and the movement toward that point. That's just my thought. I certainly hope he's held responsible.
I wanted to mention my husband, he's African-American. He's been watching this trial intensely, and I understand it's very personal for him. But he has been so impressed by the police department, the testimony they've been giving for the prosecution. He said, if the community can hear this, it's so helpful as we move forward to see that this is not acceptable behavior. No matter what the jury decides, he says, I hope they can just remember the progress that's been made within police departments themselves.
It's a radical difference. My wife and I Sharon and I just watched, it's not a new movie, but the movie Mudbound, which was a great book this week. And it's a story that takes place in the South at the end of World War II, but where violence against a black man is not only exonerated, it's celebrated. It's and there's we've moved from that point, at least some. The other chat question, Susan,
is and this goes back to maybe something that was at the very front end, is the story of Rodriguez in the movie Sugarman a true story of his music's effect on South Africa's apartheid?
I don't know the story. Who knows the story? Somebody who asked the question?
Joyce.
I did. Yeah, tell us about it.
Well, it was a few years ago, and actually that show got the Academy Award. I was so impressed by it because there's this man from Detroit who had a couple of records, and it got nowhere in the United States, but somehow those records went to South Africa. And according to the show, at least according to Sugarman, it became kind of a call to arms, let's say, for the people of South Africa. And according to the show, which I said, got the Academy Award, it made a difference. The music, the words, that he wrote in this music made a huge difference to the people of South Africa. And on your list of the methods of nonviolent action, it doesn't say anything about music.
I think music's has been a huge factor, and like in our own U.S. civil rights movement, music, the images in my own mind back to that time have very much to do with songs I remember, and hymns and songs, and in the film today, I think the advertisements employed music and songs that sound like they became popular, kind of catchphrases, and music's really powerfully important.
Yeah, think of the music in the Vietnam protests.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the Vietnam War too, the music that.
And I had heard an interview on NPR some time ago about that individual, how he couldn't make it in the United States at all, but was so popular in South Africa. So I think that is a real true story. It was on NPR at one point in time.
They said in South Africa, he was as popular or maybe more popular than Elvis.
Yeah, it was amazing. And he said he couldn't make it in the United States at all. And all of a sudden, and when he came back here, he didn't have any notoriety or anything. It was just in South Africa. It was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It just we're at 10:59, and I'm happy to stay extra minutes, but the people should be able to leave at 11. Mm-hmm. What unanswered questions do you have about nonviolent social political action or about this course?
Well, I don't have any unanswered questions, but I think looking into the future, we're going to have some interesting times ahead of us. I think the COVID has had a big effect on people being frustrated with life in general. We have the 19 2020 census coming out. And we will see how state legislatures deal with it, the gerrymandering issue, and how the courts will react to it. How does the Supreme Court will react to some of these things? I think one of the big things we have to worry about is how people perceive court decisions. And if we lose confidence in our court system, I think we lose our democracy. And you're dealing with the big lie. Last night, I was talking to somebody who's very close to me, and he tried to convince me that the reason for the changes in the Georgia election laws was because so many illegal aliens voted. And I kept asking him, show me the proof.
Show me any evidence.
Yes, and he just evaded the question. Sure. The silence of what went on in the Republican Party and the silence was deafening. I mean, nobody dared even give a mild, except for a handful of people. I mean, we can name them all. The big lie is in right now, and people just drink the juice. And but I'm really concerned about what the future of the courts, because I think that's if the people don't agree with the court's decisions, we'll have some real problems.
Yeah, well, hopefully, I mean, yeah, I totally agree that we have real worries. You know, it feels important. It always feels important to me to find ways to be hopeful and to look for ways to be hopeful. But you know, while at the same time dealing with, and there are a lot of things we can't control. This course hopefully, you know, is a way to think about changes and about changes that we would like to see, you know, when we're up against, you know, a kind of a stacked deck one way or another. But these are not easy things to do either. They're difficult, and I think one of the things that I take away is, and thinking of Solnit's essay as well as everything that we've seen in all of these examples, is just how important it is to be willing to get out in the street, to be willing to show what we think and feel and what we support, rather than just nodding at our image in the mirror. So I encourage you, and along with me, to kind of think in that vein. We have a lot of other questions we could talk about, but I think we need to end this. I'd be happy to be in conversation with anybody about questions by email or anything as well. My email address, can they get that, Susan? Or I can.
I've got it. It's
an easy one. It's just TR Shorts, TRSHORTS@gmail.com.
And I think that you've been CC'd on all the communications, so everybody should have that.
Yep.
Well, let's be sure to all express our thanks and gratitude for Tom sharing your knowledge, and just as importantly, your passion for this subject. It's been a wonderful 4 weeks.
Oh, thank you. You all have made it very enjoyable from this end too. I think you've been a great group. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you. There was one thing I wanted to mention at the end that I just stood out for me, and it said for dictatorship to succeed, you need an obedient populace, you need cooperation and submission. So the people have to agree to be in that sort of a role. So if we want it different than that, we have to think about our own role in a democracy. So I think that was really an important point that he made. And I think this might have been in Sharp's writing, I'm not sure. But
Yeah.
anyway, so it depends upon us. We all have a role to play. Thanks so
Even-
much.
Even to make ourselves uncomfortable.
Yeah.
This has been a very good group.
It really is.
Take care.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you,
Tom.
everyone. Have a
Thank you,
wonderful
Tom.
day.
Bye-bye. Thank
All
you.
right.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Yeah, Tom jumped off. Brad, thank you very much. for
Yeah,
your-
thank you. This was the easiest facilitating I've ever had to do.
Super powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Good group, a lot of participation. Not too big, so the questions were easy to handle, and we only got dangerously close to some things a couple times.
Yeah, exactly. And I didn't say this because I don't choose to speak up, but this is nonviolent sociopolitical action by just gathering in a group of people and talking about progress and
Absolutely.
and this is, and so, you know, the generations that we are teaching, our children and your grandchildren have a very different view than really the people that are mostly in power right now. So I think that's the arc of the moral universe right there, is us being on this call, going back, you know, Chris's brother walked in, it's just the two of us right now, walked in, and he was on mute, and I just, you know, kind of told him a little bit about this class, and it's the conversation. It's you talking to Barbara. It's this is it. So this is what we can do right now, and when this trial, if it does go awry and violence is a result of it, which is understandable in some, I mean, you can understand how that would happen. We just have to
Truly.
discussing it in a nonviolent way. And I have so much more information now to talk to people about what that means. I'm so inspired. So
Yeah, it was time well spent, like a lot of these classes.
yep. Well, have a great, it's only Wednesday, so it's not the weekend. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you soon.
You too. Thank
Okay.
you for all you do.
Okay, thank you. Bye.